And 2 o'clock. Good evening. Good morning. Hello. Wherever you may be, whatever time you may be. And nice to have you with me. A few hours ago, I didn't know if I was going to make it to tonight. Just wasn't feeling great, but feeling better now. No, not coronavirus or anything like that, just normal stuff. So hello, Chris, Andrew, Patrick, Suzanne, Enrique, and Petra, just to name those who've already said hello. And great pleasure to have you with me. I'm going to be continuing my reading from Caliban's Hour, which was a very short novel that I published quite a few years ago now, over 25 years. And it's going to be several nights reading, so we'll be doing this one for a while. I hope those of you who are still in lockdown are doing well. We are, because among other things, both my wife Deborah and our daughter are both a bit immunocompromised in terms of their susceptibility to pulmonary things and stuff like that. So we are being very cautious, as you would imagine, and so we're not going to be hurrying out anywhere, even when the shelter-in-place stuff, is finally dispersed. So, in the interim, though, it's good to be here, and it's good to get a chance to share some time with everybody. Let me give you a quick précis on what I'm reading. For those of you who are not aware, this is the British edition. You don't need to see the name of the writer, but Caliban's Hour. And the story is both a sequel and a prequel to Shakespeare's The Tempest. And in the first part, we got the sequel part, where some 20 plus years after the events of The Tempest, the play, Caliban, the monster, the beast, the thing, the slave of Prospero, the wizard, has made his way back to, not back because he'd never been there, but he's made his way to Italy, where Miranda, Prospero's daughter, now lives, who is herself now a grown woman with children, including her very unhappy daughter, Violetta, who is like Miranda, but has not had her opportunities to see things and experience the world. Anyway, so, and that night, as Miranda is sleeping in her room, Caliban comes through the window and tells her basically, I'm going to kill you, but first you're going to listen to what you and your father did to me when you came to my island and changed my life. So that's the basic premise of what's going on, and Caliban has now started to tell his story, and I'm going to read the last paragraph from last time just to get you focused. He's talking about his mother, Sycorax, who has been banished as a witch from Algiers, and who, with Caliban, the baby inside her, washed up on the shore of this island because she was set adrift in a boat. But he's talking to Miranda because he's telling her about what has been done to him. So, and again, so that is Caliban's Hour, and we are still in the section called A Mouthful of Words. So, you are wondering, if your father did not know these tales, how do I know them? Much he taught me, some few true things, many lies, but he was not the first to catechize me. I had learning of many sorts at my mother's knee, and though there were no words, I see still the pictures she put in my head. Her own thoughts. She did not speak to me at all, and seldom even grunted, but what I remember most of her face was a mouth like a pocket that was almost never opened. But somehow there are pictures. I will tell you of that later. Until I came, my mother succored herself in that new world with the fruit and stupidly overconfident fish and cramlets, the same with which we continued to feed ourselves throughout my childhood. For the island was well provided in everything we needed. All necessities were given swiftly and for little cost. As soon as I could walk by myself, I could forage for the prickly fruit with the green rind, or the sweet plantain, or those red sacks of juice that your father called wasp apples, finding and plucking them as easily as bending to pick up a pebble. I feasted, then threw aside stones and seeds. By the time a few moons had turned, new fruit bushes and trees would be growing there. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired, and except for my mother's whims, lived as free and unthinking as any beast. I had no name, just as she had not, until your father told me. Sycorax, he said she was called, and it has ever felt foreign to me. I was not even boy or you, for my mother had no speech. I was a look in her eye that meant, come here, a beckoning hand, or at most a grunt, a sound like a sow snuffling in soft earth. That exhalation was my only name until you and your father arrived. It was enough. I was, and I knew it. Who else could it be who saw the lizards on the rock when my mother was not there? Who else ate the fruit my mother did not eat, or climbed the trees that my leathery but brittle mother could not climb? Who else did Sycorax beckon to? I existed, and I needed no name to prove it. Unlike those maggoty multitudes creeping and sleeping in Naples below, like identical bees in the slots of a great hive, I was small, but I was the only thing like me. If my mother was my first god, I was her only worshipper, and thus all important. For what use is a god without devotees? I have now seen the huge churches of Naples. Although I heard of them from your father, Miranda, and saw pictures in his books, I could not quite believe any building so tall could exist. Now I believe, but I still do not understand. If your God is everywhere, if he is always watching, why should your people make houses to go to worship him? Faced with an all-seeing, everywhere being God, I would think that what is needed is a place to hide. I had to find such a place on my island, for if my mother was my God, she was often a jealous deity. Just as no tie of blood would make her pay notice to me when she did not wish to, so also no complaint or resistance would fend off her attentions when I did not want them. Whether I was eating, sleeping, or moving my bowels, when my mother called for me, I was to come, and quickly. As I grew out of infancy, it seemed that there were countless things I could not do, ways I could not be, faces I could not make. My mother beat me when I annoyed her, although what it was that caused her anger was seldom obvious. Other times she would clutch me and hold me, keening and mumbling in her wordless way, as if I were the only thing that kept her heart from bursting in her breast. Did I say that I loved her? For I did, helplessly, and no beating ever changed that. Yet still there were times when I could not bear to be with her, as if my very love for her was a hole yawning beneath my feet, threatening to swallow me up. As I grew older, my need for independence became a strong hunger. If I left in the morning and was gone all day, I would earn a thrashing, but only one. To remain instead by her side was to risk a score of unexpected blows, and just as many equally unexpected, and almost equally disturbing, displays of miserating affection. But she knew the island almost as well as I did. It was not enough to be merely out of reach. If so, any one of dozens of trees or rocks would have sufficed. I had to be out of her sight and the sound of her grunting voice as well. It was a strange magic my mother had. Perhaps all mothers have it. I do not know. But to be near her was to feel the need to obey her. There was one particular place that tugged at my attention, a valley. Not strenuously distant from the hut in which my mother and I lived. Set in the embrace of the nearest rocky foothills, it was nevertheless one of the few places we had not explored, since the only path down into it was choked by brambles, each branch of which carried thorns as long as the first two knuckles of my finger. Effectively barred to us, it was much in my imagination, and I would often loiter at the top of the path beside the thorn hedge, although there were higher places on the island, spots where the view was better and that were harder for my mother to reach. One day I was crawling along the top of this path on my hands and knees, following the progress of an insect which looked for all the world like an ambulatory stick. In truth, in my open-hearted acceptance of wonders, I assumed it was a stick, just some heretofore unencountered variety that happened to walk. In any case, this particular stick at last turned and blithely strolled into the shelter of the brambles. I stared after it sadly, knowing it was beyond my reach, wishing that I could be so small and disappear so easily. But as I looked at the place it had gone, I saw that, although the thorny branches entwined too thickly to allow passage for anything much larger than the now escaped insect, it did not quite touch the ground. Each bramble bush sprouted from a central trunk, and there were only a half-dozen such trunks across the width of the path, although the tangling made it appear one continuous hedge. I lowered myself onto my belly and saw that there was indeed a space beneath the thorns, a little less tall than the width of my palm. I sat up again, disappointed. I was still far too big. Even lying flat on my back, I would be scraped, bloody, and raw before I pushed myself a yard in. Then a sudden thought sent me scrambling back down the hillside. I searched the ground and soon discovered what I needed, a pair of fallen branches from one of the larger trees, each branch nearly as tall as I was, both relatively straight, especially after I had broken off the smaller cross limbs. I went back to the thorn hedge, pushed the branches under its skirt, and lifted. A slightly wider gap opened. Holding these makeshift staves carefully, I rolled onto my back, then slid headfirst into the space. The brambles hung like storm clouds just above my face, shuddering as the sticks in my hands trembled beneath the weight of the intertwined branches. I gently slid the sticks forward, shutting my eyes in panic for a moment when it seemed as though the suspended bramble might break free and smash down on me. Then I inched myself further along. Again, the sticks held the thorns just high enough, although one or two now grazed my chest, digging as my mother's sharp fingernails did when I overslept. It was a long and dreadful process. The two sticks grew slippery in my sweaty hands. Dust, long undisturbed, sifted down from the bushes and into my mouth and nose and eyes, and my muscles grew weak. When I had pushed in the entire length of my body, it occurred to me that I was now trapped. It was virtually impossible to turn around, and should the distance ahead prove to be too far, what if the thorns extended all the way down the valley? My strength would quickly give out, the brambles would sag, and I would lie hidden and bleeding until I died. Crying only made it harder to keep moving, so I did my best to restrain my tears. Even were I to scream from my mother, what could she do? She was tough as a dried fish and stronger than I was, but it would take days for her to hack such a weight of thorn branches away with her stone knife. Creeping forward, with slow, agonizing movements of my shoulders, elbows, and heels, I at last began to feel a stronger light falling on my face. The branches were thinning. Renewed hope brought renewed strength. I pushed on until my face finally appeared from beneath the hedge. The sun dried the sweat and dust into a thin mask of mud on my face as I worked the rest of my body out from beneath the brambles. When my feet came free, scratched and bloody, I pushed on. Oh, sorry. When my feet came free, scratched and bloody, I rolled onto my side and lay panting in the dirt like the wounded, terrified animal I was. But youth is resilient, Miranda. You obviously believe that, for did you not send your own girl child off tonight, certain that those things which gall her so today will be forgotten tomorrow? And the young are resilient when they have not been pushed beyond their capability. Thus it was not long until young Caliban, or young No-Name, as I still was then, was on his feet again, admiring the new lands which his bravery had conquered. Do you remember that valley, Miranda? I took you there once. Surely you remember that place, that day. Surely. Beyond the brambles lay a miniature paradise, an afterlife to which either Christian or pagan would be glad to awaken. A small stream flowed down the slope beside me, its source hidden in the widening of the thorn hedge. Long grass, a wind-combed crest that reached my knees, lined the stream's path and spread into a tiny meadow at the bottom of the narrow valley. Around the meadow, like protective spirits, stood a ring of delicate, round-leaved trees. At their center stood the only object taller than the valley's walls, a huge, ancient pine tree. I had seen its bristling apex from other high places on the island, but to the extent I had thought of it, I had assumed it grew from some place along the valley's mounting walls. Now I could see that its trunk stretched a good dozen times my height, that its powerful roots had pushed the rocks aside in their growth as casually as an uneasy sleeper kicks away a cloak. Although everything in the valley was new to me, the tuneful noise of the water, so much gentler and more friendly than the sea's constant grumbling, the hum of sparkling dragonflies darting past my ears, it was the old pine that drew my attention. It seemed to have been waiting for me. In my wordless way, I sensed something of its age, something of its mystery, but not all of its mystery. No, not all. I made my way down the stream bank, the grass stems scraping at my shins, mud sucking at my toes. Despite the small noises all around, a sense of stillness and power hung over the valley. A thrill ran up the back of my neck. The fact that I had found this place made me feel taller, wider, more somehow. This expansion of my world had caused me to grow as well. It was the first thing in the world that was mine and no one else's. I felt I had come into an inheritance of sorts. It was my first day of manhood. The stream dwindled into a series of smaller rivulets and at last disappeared in a delta of matted grass. I squelched across it toward the base of the pine tree and found a place where the sun arrowed down and where the tussocks of grass were dry. Sitting, staring up at the pine's scaly branches, I thought I could feel the life of the great tree beating slowly through it like the blood I heard in my own ears sometimes as I lay waiting for sleep. A dark shape flickered in over the valley walls and lit in a branch above my head. It was a bird, sky blue, but touched at neck and wingtips with streaks of sunset red. It eyed me with such calm interest that I almost expected it to communicate with me, as my mother did, in grunts and gestures. We sat and watched each other, the bird and I, and slowly a strange idea began to creep over me. It was not the brightly colored bird that examined me, but the old pine itself. Eyeless, it had summoned something with eyes so it could look at me, a stranger thing, an intruder in its ancient domain. This odd thought brought another, even more frightening. handless, might it not summon something with curling fingers, grasping claws, to hold me until it decided what to do? I stood up slowly. The bird only tipped its head to keep its bright eyes trained on mine. I backed away until I was out of the sun and the meadow became soft and swampy again beneath my feet. Then I turned and clambered up the stream bank towards the thorn hedge. The valley had gone quiet. No dragonflies, no wind sawing the grass. Even the murmur of the water had grown more hushed. Keeping my pace slow and casual with that sense of something watching my back was the most difficult thing I had ever done. I could feel the bird's eye on me, like a finger against my spine. When I reached the thorn hedge, I turned. The valley still lay like a jeweled egg in a nest. The pine tree still loomed. The bright bird was gone. As the fear ebbed, a kind of stubborn anger replaced it. This was my valley, I told myself. I had no words for that, but in a world where anything could be snatched from me at a moment's notice by my mother's gnarled brown fingers, the concept was as distinct as a single cloud in an empty sky. Mine. Even the tree, whatever it was, whatever it thought of me, was somehow mine. I would not be chased away. I would come back to this place whenever I wished. I bobbed my head towards the ancient pine, a recognition of an equal rather than homage to a victor, then turned and made my painful, slow way back out beneath the brambles. Do not speak, Miranda. I see by your look that you remember that place only too well, that you remember your treachery. What other word is there? Even with all the serried ranks of noun and verb at my command, I can find no other way to describe what you did to me there. Stay, stay. Here, feel. My hand is upon your neck. You must not struggle. I have not reached that part of the story yet, and you must hear it all. But once again, I have raced ahead. There is time yet, more than enough time. Before you and your father came, before my mother's death, before I even reached the hidden valley, I was alive. If tonight is the only time my story is told, then I shall tell it in full. The first thing I can remember is my mother bending low over the cook fire, its glow playing across the sharp-edged face that sun and grime had darkened like old leather. How old was I? I will never know. It was an evening like many, many hundred others. We lived in a hut of leaning sticks that she had built at the edge of the forest. A wide porch of sand stretched from the door down to the sea. I was amazed when I went back to see it, Miranda, after spending those years in the compound your father built, which I largely built, if the truth be told, acting as a slave, laboring at his will. But when I returned to the place I had been born and lived, I was astonished to see how small it was, scarcely larger than a shell for a man-sized crab. My mother and I had spent most of our time beneath the sky, and perhaps some idea of that greater and supremely vaulting roof overhead had colored my memories. It was a dark cave, the house of my childhood, with a hole in the top to let some, but never enough, of the smoke float free. My mother was mad, as I suppose I too am now mad. What else can people be who have seen their entire lives snatched away from them, and for no greater crime than being what they are? The choking, stifling unfairness of it is a permanent sore, one that can be lived with, but never forgotten. Left to my mother's teachings and no other, though, I believe I would have been sane. In the universe that surrounded her, things simply were. To my childish eyes, she was unhappy in the same way that the day was hot or the tide was high. But your father, gagging on the injustices that had been done to him, taught me, along with the words that could describe such an alien thing in the first place, the cursed idea that there was such a thing as justice, as fairness, as right and wrong. Oh, wretched, cruel man. Yes, in her own way, my mother was certainly mad. She sang to the storms, hunched in the shapeless black garments she had worn on her day of punishment and exile, and which were the only things she ever wore, however tattered and threadbare they became. She would squat outside the hut while I peered anxiously through the low doorway. And as the squall matted her gray-shot hair and soaked her ragged dress, she would bellow and moan to the sky. Only the rhythms, which still betimes float up into my thoughts unbidden, tell me that this was more than bestial anger or fear. As the wind howled and the lightning cracked, she sang. To my childish eyes, all three were equally powerful, equally frightsome. Other times, such as on the night of my earliest memory, she sat and stared into the fire and dreamed for long, long hours, clucking and gurgling to herself. On some of those nights, her dreams swam into my head, murky visions of things I could not recognize, but which I feel sure were the places of her life before the island. Flat, brown earth, mud houses, dry hills, and faces, angry and accusing. Imagine, Miranda, until you and Prospero came, the only human faces I saw, the only faces that peopled my dreams, were the ghosts out of my mother's bitter reveries. All men are made by those who raise them, it is true. But was ever a man so crookedly shaped by two people, my mad mother and your cold father? They were the two opposites that swelled to fill my universe. Is it any wonder that I came to love you, Miranda? What else did I have? What else could I hope for? One storm that I never saw myself but experienced often in my mother's brooding dreams must have happened soon after her landfall while I was still nestled inside her belly. The vision of it came again and again, although it was only after she died that I came to understand its meaning. On that dreamt-of night, the wind blew fiercely, the waves leaped high, and sprays of pale foam leaped higher still. The great palm trees of the forest's edge bent nearly double. Then something fell burning from the sky. It struck the beach in a mighty gout of flame, a fire bigger than anything my mother could have made if she had stacked dry timber for a week. A moment later, the blaze was only a crackle of red and amber light. Something rose from the pit it had dug into the sand, amorphous as smoke, but fast coalescing. My mother fought with it. I know not how she did or why, but when her dreams of that night crept into me, I could sense her fear, her anger, and even a taste of the cold satisfaction she felt when, after a long and nightmarish struggle, she at last found the chain of thought that would bind the thing. Nothing in her dream told me what had happened after that. Some great battle had been waged, and I had been raised upon the empty battlefield, but I would never know its meaning, the truth of its resolution, or So I thought for a long time. Next section. The whole. I had my own battles. The island was bountiful, but not always kind. Just as every branch seemed full of fruits, so juice swollen that they almost fell into my hand before I could pick them, life of other kinds thrived in equal measure. For every gaudy feathered or sweetly singing bird, there seemed a stinging insect of some kind, one of the reasons we lived in a hut full of smoke. These tiny armies were always at least a nuisance, but they were particularly vicious when twilight came. There were as many different types, it sometimes seemed, as there were grains of sand on the beach. 100-legged worms, biting flies, green crawlers, jewel-shelled buzzers, flitterwings, scattersands, blanket burrowers, each with its own determination and skills, each bent on piercing my young flesh. I quickly learned to wash the fruit nectar from my face and hands when I had finished eating, for that drew them faster than anything. I also went about much of the time wearing a second skin of dried mud, which at least kept the shorter-toothed varieties at bay. There were serpents on the island, too, and in nearly as great variety, from tiny thread vipers scarcely the length of a finger to a single, vast, and luckily slow-moving python, which lived in the trees on the island's far side. A beast 10 paces long and as thick around as my waist, covered all over with a pattern of black and white and brown scales as intricate as any carpet in this great house of yours. I never let that old devil close enough to cause me any harm, but I often saw his glittering eye as he hung motionless from a branch, taking the sun, and imperiously watching all that passed, especially a plump morcelet like myself. He was in no hurry. For all I know, he is back there on the island still, waiting. Perhaps he shall still get his chance with me someday. One particular morning I was wandering on a hillside on the sunward side of the island. You may remember it, since the breadfruit trees grew there. This day was before you came, before my mother went gasping and thrashing to her death. It had been raining, and the ground and leaves were damp. Even the air was wet. I was swishing along, kicking my feet in the tall grass to see the drops scatter, when I heard a rustling sound. I dropped to my hands and knees, frightened, for whatever lurked in the undergrowth sounded quite large. I knew it was not my mother, for I had left her grinding roots on a flat stone before our hut only a short time earlier. Except for the great serpent, most of the animals that shared the island were smaller than me. There were a few timid deer and slot-eyed goats, who seldom came down from the high places, at least by day. The monkeys who harbored in the deep forest were unafraid to roam by the sun's light, but they were none of them much taller than my knee, and also spent little time on the ground. Needless to say, I was both fearful of and fascinated by whatever might make such a commotion in the deep grasses. As I lay peering, my chest and chin pressed against the sodden black earth, the stems leaned apart and a clutch of small pigs pushed out, snouts wrinkling as they swaffled with excitement. They were almost hairless, mottled, gray, and pink, and they gave no greater sign of alarm on seeing me than to change slightly the sound of their snorting. They inspected me for a long moment, then resumed nosing the earth, shoving and bumping each other when it seemed that one of them might have found something interesting. I watched, entranced. I may even have laughed. Then their mother appeared. She was huge by any measure, a mountain of muscle and fat and coarse bristles, embellished with a red-shot eye. To a child lying on the ground at her feet, she appeared an almost indescribable monstrosity. If my mother had been capable of telling me tales of Satan and his demons, I promptly would have granted that sow a high seat in hell's pantheon. There's a picture. Oops. It's always hard to find where the... There's a picture. See the little satellites, little piglets. All right. I had a momentary flash there of being on a children's TV show. The only thing that saved me was sheer, terrified rabbiting. While she stared at me for an instant, then lowered her head, I sprang to my feet, took a step and a half to the nearest tree, and leaped. If the tree had been a pace further, I would have died. Of that I have no doubt. As it was, I caught only a glancing blow from her tusked mouth, but even so it tore a great furrow down my leg, which I did not notice until I had climbed to the highest branch I could reach. When I finally saw the blood rushing out of me, I nearly fell. I clutched the edges of ripped skin together and looked down. Grunting indignantly, the sow was circling the tree trunk, pausing from time to time to fix me with her malicious little eyes. The sight of her frightened me so badly that I almost lost my balance and tumbled, and I swear that she knew that. She moved to a spot just below me, waiting, but I only swayed for a moment before regaining my footing on the blood-slicked branch. Wordless though I was, still I knew that there were certain things I should do. My mother had tied me and patched me after enough mishaps. I went always naked in those days, except for armoring mud, so there was nothing from which to make a bandage. The tree itself had not leaves, but needles. There was nothing I could do to staunch my bleeding, except hold the flaps of my gashed leg together with my fingers. And the sow would not go. The piglets seemed perfectly content to mill about in the clearing beneath the tree, digging with their tiny snouts and squealing at one another, so there was nothing to draw the mother away. A dragging hour went past, and still they would not leave. The small creatures that had so charmed me only a short while earlier now seemed demons tormenting me on purpose. How I cursed them in my thoughts, wordlessly, even as I soaked the ground with tears and blood, but to no avail. The piglets gamboled and slept in the tree's shade, bellies puffing in and out. The mother watched me with an eye red as my wound, cold as a river stone. The day wore on, and I clung to the branch, dizzy, weak, and increasingly certain that nothing could save me. I shouted for my own mother, of course. I shrieked until my voice was a ragged wheeze, but here I had invited my own misfortune. Sycorax had become used to my roving, if not reconciled. I might get a beating on my return, but she had long since stopped searching for me, since she knew I had found hiding places she could not reach. I made the clearing echo with my wordless wailing, bellowed until it seemed I must shake the sky off its fundamental pillars, but no one came. The sun moved higher in the sky overhead, turning the gray sky warm and bright, steaming the last moisture from the earth and vegetation, but not before I had licked up every standing drop of rain within my reach. As the day grew hotter, I became weaker and more lightheaded, until it seemed I might just float off the branch like a scrap of ash and be carried away over the rough hills. Once I thought I felt my spirit slip from my body and fly to the beach where my mother squatted, frying cakes on a hot stone beside the fire. But if I truly went there, she was not aware of my spirit self, of my need. Her back remained bent, her face turned away from me as she slapped the root paste into sticky balls. In my desperate state, I may only have dreamed that my spirit departed my body. Certainly the sight of my mother making root cakes was something I knew very well. In any case, she did not come. The day grew stiflingly hot. I dipped in and out of sleep. The pain and fright would become less for a moment, and I would let myself slide down into the feeling as though into cool water. A moment later, I would awake in heart-speeding terror as I felt myself beginning to pitch forward, and the sow would still be looking up, staring, waiting. And then she departed. With no warning, long before the sun touched the western horizon, she suddenly gave an angry grunt and went crashing off into the grass. Her piglets formed an untidy company and bobbled after her, tripping one another in their haste to keep up. She was finally gone. Or was she? My horrible thirst and the throbbing, wrenching ache of my leg had nearly overpowered me, but my fear of the beast was greater. I waited no little time before beginning my climb down. The journey to the bottom was excruciating. Even my good leg was painfully stiff. The agony of the other is something I can only leave you to imagine. And the climb set the wound to pumping again. I tried to run for the first few steps in case the sow should return, but it was useless. I could barely walk. I fell down several times on my journey back to the beach. On the last occasion, I almost did not get up. So powerful was the urge to slip into gentle blackness. I made my way back just after dark. It was one of the few times I saw my mother Sycorax frightened. Even as she raised her hand to slap me, she saw my leg covered from foot to thigh in blood, both dried and sticky new. Her eyes bulged, and she gave out a gurgling cry of terror that I barely even heard. She was unusually kind after she had cleaned the wound, covered it with root leaf poultices, and tied my leg tight with a strip of cloth torn from her own and only garment. She took me into the hut and cradled my head in her lap as she poured some hot liquid down my throat, then hummed wordlessly to me as I sank into the dark. You are wondering why I tell you this story, Miranda. I can see it in your face. And at the same moment, you are hoping that I have wandered so far in the field of my memories that I am now babbling, that I do not realize how the time is flying away. Not so, my inconstant friend. I know when the next guards will come, and how long after that until old Somnambulo is missed. And everything I tell you is for a reason. My speech is hot, but my heart and blood are cold, cold, cold. You see, that was the time I learned about hatred. As I shook with the fever that followed, as I lay retching up the thin broths my mother fed me, as I writhed with the pain of the healing wound, I came to hate the creature that had done this to me. At first I felt only fear. I thought I saw the sow's evil little eyes gleaming in the shadows when I could not sleep, and her hot, stinking breath seemed to follow me into my dreams. But after a while, as the horrid event itself was partially covered by the collecting pile of days, I began to concentrate instead on the injury done me, and the fear turned to black hatred. When I could stand at last and found myself a cripple, barely able to hop from one end of our stretch of beach to the other, confined by my infirmity to a stranglingly small patch of land, and to the permanent presence of my mother, whose solicitude had long since vanished, the hatred began to curdle into something cooler and more calculating. I began to ponder revenge. Long after the sow had surely forgotten me, I thought of her and wished her ill. Perhaps this is an example of what your father told you so many times, that I was and am no better than a beast myself. I wonder. In any case, I had been wronged and could not forget. I would return pain for pain, at least. I learned to hate. I learned to take a wrong and treasure it like a tiny spark on a cold, wet evening. Each time that the passage of days or the improvement of my health came near to extinguishing that spark, I held it close and blew on it until it flamed again. I nurtured the heat. I held it close to me, although sometimes it was an exhausting task. Never underestimate how much work there is in hatred, Miranda. When I could walk well enough to leave the confines of my mother's domain again, I made my way back to the hillside where I had been so unfairly attacked. I carried a sharp, fire-hardened stick, which gave me at least a small sense of protection, although, in truth, I think it would have been of little more use than fingernails and teeth against that huge creature. Nevertheless, in some obscure way, I felt better with it grasped in my hand. I had made the spear some seasons before and had used it from time to time to poke, rather uselessly, at the bright fish that sheltered among the rocks in the ocean shallows. At least the sow would be a larger and less elusive target. So, my heart pounding and rattling in my breast, I returned to the place where death's wing had brushed me. But for the hoof prints of the sow and her young in the mud, there was no sign of my nemesis. I knelt on the spot where they had first crossed the clearing before me and began to dig. A gob of mud came up in my cupped hands. I tossed it aside and gouged again. It was not the work of a single day, although I had emptied a great trough in the wet soil by the time the sun began to sink. Muddy and exhausted, my leg aching so that the walk back was only slightly easier than on the day the sow had torn it, I returned to my mother's silent company. After eating, I fell asleep quickly and was back in my pit before the sun was above the hilltop the next morning. Towards the middle of the day, I stopped to drink some of the water which had collected in a hollow of stone. After I drank, I surveyed what I had made, the gouge in the earth that was now deeper than I was tall, a black hole, empty but for the wide tree branch propped against the side to help me climb in and out. Thin tendrils of root protruded from the torn soil, white and shocked. The sight made me uncomfortable. There was something wrong with the hole. I could feel that, but I could not discern what it was. I puzzled for a long time, so long that the mud that coated me dried to a scaly crust. No matter how I paced about the hole's rim or squinted at its steep sides, I could see nothing. It was a pit, a place in which to trap the creature which had tried to kill me. It was made exactly as it should be made. Why did the sight of it disturb me so? Shrugging, I clambered back down into the hole and resumed my labors. When the sun fell behind the pit's deepening side, the muddy earth suddenly became abruptly colder. I looked up, and although the sky was still the same cloudy blue, the darkness of the hole felt oppressive. I decided that I had dug deep enough. I had a moment of fear when the branch I used for climbing slipped a little on the pit's damp wall, and I almost fell back down. But enough of my upper body was balanced on the rim to pull myself out. I turned and dragged the branch up after me, then spent the rest of the diminishing afternoon covering the hole, first with a mat woven of long, flexible branches, then with sod and leaves. When I was finished, it was almost impossible to detect that this patch of ground was different from any other part of the hillside. My mother never ventured so far from the hut anymore, and something as light as a monkey or the island's small deer would not break the screen of branches. Only my enemy would find herself the victim of my diligent hatred. So why was I still troubled? My understanding tried beyond its undeveloped powers, I returned to the beach. I did not sleep well that night, but lay long past moonrise, with my hands behind my head, staring up into the dim, shadowy corners of the hut, listening with growing unrest to my mother's harsh snoring. When I did fall asleep, I tumbled into a deeper darkness full of staring eyes, squealing, shrieking voices, and the scent of blood. A curious shakiness was on me when I awoke. I loitered about the camp all morning, strangely unwilling to go and check my trap. But at last my mother cuffed me for some minor irritation, and I stamped off into the forest. It took me no little time to make my way up to that place on the hillside where I had spent so much of the previous days. I found a dozen things to catch my attention. Monkeys playing games in the high branches of a fruit tree. A newborn butterfly with wings each as wide as my hand, drying itself in the sun. A new dam of sticks forming in one of the streams birthed in the mountain's highland. Virtually everything I saw seemed more interesting than the pit. But at last I reached the spot where I had labored so long and saw immediately that my efforts had been successful. The branches that had screened the trap were a shattered ruin. The dirt and leaves that had hidden them had fallen away so that the hole gaped as nakedly as when I had first finished digging. And something was grunting angrily in the depths of the earth. I crept to the edge, more than half convinced that my enemy, if it was indeed she, might be spurred by the sight of me to leap all the way out. I knew little or nothing of pigs, and just enough of her cruel strength to consider anything possible. She did indeed give a great honking cry when I peered over the rim and charged the pit's walls, but the soil only crumbled beneath her flailing trotters. I shied away, but after a few moments regained my courage and moved back to where I could look down on what I had accomplished. Years later, I saw in one of your father's books a picture of a demon immured in hell. The artist had done his best to show both the monstrousness of its evil and the hopeless anguish of the damned soul festering within it. Until that moment, I had been delighted with the engravings, charmed by the art that could make a representation at once so flat and so intricate. But when I saw that demon's image, I went cold and shut the book. I had seen that look before. The sow was hunkered down at the bottom of the pit, so covered in mud that she seemed almost an excrescence of the troubled earth. Her eyes gleamed wickedly out of the blackness, and when she saw me again, she bellowed her anger, her tusked yawp a great vibrating red gouge. Her stinking breath floated up in a cloud. But she was trapped, and it showed in her every movement, sounded in her cries. All her strength and ferocity could do nothing. She was helpless. What she could reach, she could seize and rend and destroy, but she could not fight her own bulk or the unresisting soil which only fell away beneath her scrabbling feet. Because she could not understand, she could not escape. I was both delighted and horrified to see that in her miserable fury she had rasped at her own legs so that they were as coated with dirt-caked blood as my own had been. I had won. Still, there was something about the immensity of her suffering that left me feeling curiously empty. I stared for a while at the damned, furious eyes, then stood and walked away down the hillside. I do not know how long I wondered, but I found myself at last in front of the thorn hedge that guarded my secret valley. I made my way beneath the brambles and walked down through the damp meadow to the base of the great pine tree, which this time gave off no feeling of menace or challenge, but rather seemed somehow welcoming. I sat leaning against the rough bark and stared up to the green lacework of needles, dizzying myself with the height of the trunk that stretched up above me. While I walked, my thoughts had been flittering in all directions inside my head, aimless and unhelpful as flies. The hatred that had spurred me was now hard to remember. I had a dim sense of the sow, of her angry fearfulness, and that in turn had reminded me of the look on my mother's face when I had returned with my wounded leg. Had not the sow been protecting her own children as my mother would have protected me? Should she be punished for that? During the planning of my revenge, I had thought once of luring her piglets to me and killing them before her eyes, the worst revenge against a mother I could, or for that matter, can now, imagine. I could no longer bear that thought. What crime could warrant such terrible, terrible punishment? What crime, Miranda? Surely nothing so simple as what the sow had done. Now I could not imagine inflicting any more punishment on her at all. She was terrified and trapped. Surely that was enough. In truth, the taste of my victory was far less sweet than I had imagined. I considered how I might set her free, should I choose to do so. I was not so foolish as to imagine she would be grateful, so any method of release had to encompass my own safety. Perhaps I thought I could balance a large log beside the edge of the pit and then tip it over with my spear from the safety of a tree branch, allowing her to climb out. But even as I played with these thoughts and enjoyed the warm sensation of magnanimity that suffused me like a golden mist, something else began to creep into my mind. At first it was hardly notable, merely a sullen irritation that I should contemplate giving the author of my injuries the reprieve she would never have given to me. But then as I leaned back against the tree and watched its branches blowing back and forth, slowly swaying, the feeling became stronger. I experienced again as strongly as when it had first happened the pain of my leg and my terror that I would die. How could I so quickly forget what she had done to me? Again I saw the face of the trapped sow in my mind's eye, but this time her rage had nothing of fright in it, only pure malignity. The thoughts of mercy I had been harboring suddenly seemed weak. I pushed back against the tree trunk and felt strength flowing into me, angry strength, as though the vitality of the old pine passed through its bark and into my blood. It was almost as if the ancient tree itself was stiffening my resolve, helping me turn away from my earlier laughable weakness. Only a few more moments passed before I leapt to my feet and clambered back up the meadow to the thorn hedge. I hurried back toward my trap. It did not take me long to find a boulder which, with only a little digging, I could free from the muddy hillside's embrace. Rolling it down toward the pit, bracing it with sticks to keep it moving in the direction I wished, I felt an almost supernatural control and power. The sow began squealing again as she heard my approach, a terrible, ragged sound that made me want to put my fingers in my ears. Instead, I leaned my shoulder against the poised stone and pushed with all my might, feet slipping and then finally digging in. The boulder rocked and the rim collapsed, and it toppled over. There was a terrible wet thump, then a long train of bubbling gasps, trailed at last by silence. Later, I took some of the blood and returned to the valley, where I daubed it on the old pine tree's trunk. Then, all feelings of victory replaced by exhausted emptiness, I returned to the hut and slept a long, black, and dreamless sleep. Ah, you did not know about the sow, did you, Miranda? I never told you. I think I was ashamed. But tonight, what is the night your folk wear masks and then take them off again? Midsummer's Eve? Tonight the hidden faces will be seen. Human faces can be masks too, although I did not understand that for most of my young life. The idea of hiding thoughts behind an unrevealing expression was something I learned from Prospero, who showed almost nothing to the world. Even slower to come was the conception of placing a mask over someone else's face, of seeing in them only what one wishes to see. I wonder what you first thought when you saw me staring down from the rocks on the day of your arrival. I had eyes mostly for your dreadful, fascinating father, who my alarmed senses told me was by far the greater threat, although now I am not so sure that was true. You were only an appurtenance then. It was later I would come to understand what your name meant. But what did you see crouching on the rock before you? A huddled brown thing with yellow eyes that stared as a baby bird gawps from its nest? An unfurred monkey, lithe and long-armed? Or an ill-made doll, like a poor copy formed from mud of some toy from your lost childhood? Was that your thought when you first saw me, sad Miranda? That all your toys would now be like this, poor and unsatisfactory? I know what your father thought when he saw me, for as I scuttled back down the rock seeking shelter from his awful gaze, he told me, or rather told you. Although I could not then understand his words, he reminded me of them later when I spoke your tongue. On that day I listened for only a few moments before terror overcame me and I fled. Look, Miranda, he said. His voice was as coldly interested as if he had found me lying dead and decayed upon the sand. This apparently deserted island seems to have at least a few larger inhabitants. An ape, I think. No, perhaps something a shade more interesting. A so-called natural man. A savage. A cannibal. And as I ran, Miranda, I heard your small, puzzled voice. Caliban? And I think that's where I'm going to stop tonight. Not so much just because it's the perfect place to stop, although it's not a bad one, but because I'm doing all this vocal fry and my voice is going. So, anyway, checking back in, those who are either incredible gluttons for punishment or have a whole hell of a lot of time to kill or whatever, I will, of course, be reading 7 o'clock p.m. this evening, the evening of which it is now 3 o'clock in the morning. And I will be continuing with, I believe it is, And Ministers of Grace, the Lamentation Cain story. Until that time, I want you all to keep taking care of yourselves. Remember that we are all on this strange round spaceship together. And while that does not stop us from pointing out wrongs when they happen, it also gives us a huge responsibility to take care of our fellow passengers. And so that's all at the moment that I am advocating is kindness, justice, and thoughtfulness. In complicated times, being thoughtful is always the first step. Before talking, before acting, before anything. At least that's what I think. So I do also want to say I hope you're all staying well and staying safe, and send you a big swath of love from our house to your house, wherever that may be in the wide world. And see you again very soon, one way or the other, and I'll say good night. Good night.